Okay, so I started off with Yuuna and the Haunted Hot Springs. A medium comes to a hot spring because he hears it's haunted to exorcise a ghost, only to find out it's a cute girl, and he then changes his mind on whether he wants to exorcise her or not. He ends up living there instead to try and find a way to send her to heaven the more natural way by helping her get over her past regrets. Unfortunately, she has amnesia and doesn't actually know what those regrets are. Pretty generic story. And the hot spring inn happens to be inhabited entirely by various yokai women. And so it's basically just a generic harem comedy. It even uses the same tired tropes that have been beaten to death 20 years ago. So the girls were pretty cute, and some of the situations were okay. It was the comedy sections were interspersed by more action-packed sequences. Overall, it was a decent enough watch, but nothing to really talk in length about. Then I watched the Violet Evergarden special. Normally I wouldn't talk about a special one-off episode on this show, but I felt it was a pretty noteworthy episode, more for what it represents than what it actually showed. The basic idea behind the episode is Violet is contracted to write song lyrics, basically, by an opera singer for a play. And it was a good episode of Violet Evergarden, but I don't know if I would say it's my favorite episode, but what it did show is something that I'd been suspecting for a while, which is that I might have underrated Violet Evergarden when I first watched it. So I boosted the score up from this, because it made me realize that Violet Evergarden deserved a bit more than I gave it. So did Overlord too, but that's a different story. Then I watched March Comes In Like a Lion. March Comes In Like a Lion is about basically a angsty, depressed teenage boy with an inferiority complex who happens to be a professional shogi player, and he meets 3 girls. One of them is fairly interesting, the other 2 are just moe blobs. And it's about how he deals with his depression. Now, the thing about the main character is that he doesn't his life is actually great if you look at it. You know, he makes more money than his teacher. Everyone around him they just bend over backward to help him, really. Everyone's nice to him. I mean, he doesn't have any friends at school other than his teacher, but even that starts to change towards the end of the show. So there's not even a real reason for him to be depressed, but I feel like in a way that's actually kind of more realistic, because depression doesn't require you to be depressed for a reason. It's more of like a mental condition. What the show does do is it has a sort of subtle character progression, specifically for the main character. It's less like a lion, like the title would suggest, and more like a gentle breeze, flowing subtly and softly from the start of the story to the end of the story. And the main character doesn't have these moments where he makes sudden realizations. It's more like over time and over his interactions with other characters, he gradually begins to change. Comparing him from the start of the show, where he doesn't even want to go over to the girls' houses, to the end of the show where he'll just show up for not necessarily the fun of it because he's still depressed, but he at the end it shows him willingly going over to their house to have dinner, or the difference in how assertive he is from the beginning to the end. And I think it shows this gradual, realistic character progression really well. In fact, I'd say the entire show is pretty well made from a production standpoint. And another thing it does really well is demonstrates the complex feelings of the character. Because it's so tied to the main character and his inner monologues, we get to see most notably his feelings on his older sister and Shogi, both of which we get conflicting statements from him on, of whether he likes Shogi and his older sister, or he hates Shogi or his older sister. And this isn't actually to the show's detriment, because what it successfully portrays is that it's actually a mixture of feelings. There are things he enjoys about it and things he doesn't, and he flip-flops internally, and by the end of the season, you don't come away with a true understanding of whether he likes Shogi and his sister, or whether he hates them. And I think that's notable because I don't think he knows either. And so it really properly portrays his complex feelings. March Comes In Like a Lion does a good job of portraying its at least main character and general premise realistically, even if the characters surrounding him, with the exception of like 2 people, aren't necessarily the most in-depth. My biggest issue with the show is its just general premise, because the main character is basically just a normal depressed teenager. And if you were to shove a camera into the brain of a normal depressed teenager, I don't think it would make a very interesting show. And I don't think March Comes In Like a Lion makes a very interesting show either. I can certainly see why people would appreciate it, but it is definitely not something I was into. The show never made me bored, but it never made me interested or gave me a reason to care about anything that was happening, and so I never did. It was a little too much like a breeze and not enough like a lion. Then I finished off with Aguu, Genius Dolls. This was an interesting series. The general premise is that the gods will bestow heroic spirits onto people, not like Fate series, but more like blessings or boons upon people when they're born. And it will create geniuses and give them amazing talents based on which god blessed them. But there is a group of people called the Tailors who will capture these people and will bind them to create these dolls that can be physically shrunken down and implanted into a person's body to give them the talents that the god had bestowed upon the person itself. And the reason this is considered evil is because they're physically taking a person and just torturing them to gain the talents for themselves. And these Aguu aren't just possessed by the Tailors, they can also be given to other people. And it's revealed very early into the show that a large group of influential and wealthy families possess various amounts of Aguu that they can just trade back and forth. So it's not one Aguu per god. A god can very clearly make as many as they fucking want. So it's rare, but it doesn't seem to be terribly rare, and it's mentioned that there's over 1,000, I think it was 1,024 types of Aguu. Anyway, so the main character doesn't know this at first, but then she quickly learns about it from an old man and his grandson, and finds out that her best friend is in possession of Aguu. I don't feel bad mentioning this. This shows up in like episode 1. And she ends up joining together with the old man and the grandson to basically free up the Aguu who are being tortured by the Tailors. Now, I've seen a lot of claims that this show has a bunch of plot holes, and most of the complaints I've seen about the plot holes in the show aren't actually plot holes. It's kind of like a beatless situation where it's like you just weren't paying enough attention, or you weren't thinking about the subject hard enough to see that it totally makes sense. The exception of this is 3 times where, although I can justify certain plot twists, it actually like feels like I have to justify it, which tells me that chances are the writers just fucked up. And you could say that 3 plot holes is a lot of plot holes comparatively, and I would say, you know what, fair enough. Where the show actually gets itself in deep water is it loves these plot twists constantly. I don't actually know how many plot twists are in this show, but the answer is a lot of them. And it keeps you on your toes, and it certainly kept me interested. That and the whole concept of the show, and I kind of like the aesthetic. I've heard some animation complaints. I've never really cared about animation, but Anyway, what I will say about the biggest issue with Aguu for me isn't the plot twists or the plot holes. It's that the Taylors as villains are actually pretty interesting. So when you compare that to not the main character, but the old man and his grandson, the heroes come off really, really boring. So, otherwise, I actually found Aguu to be pretty enjoyable. If they wanted to make a second season, and they totally could with that fucking cliffhanger they left on, I'd be down, even if no one else would be. Anyway, I've been Sacrobolic, your Envoy of Hope, and this has been what I watched this week. I will see you next time. Bye-bye!